There is a place in the heart of Italy where the light seems different, softer, as if filtered through the golden dust of history itself. This is Tuscany, a land of rolling hills, ancient olive groves, and cypress trees that stand like sentinels guarding the horizon. Its capital, Florence, is not merely a city, but a living museum, the cradle of the Renaissance, a testament to the soaring heights of human genius. It is the home of Michelangelo, of Leonardo da Vinci, of Botticelli. It is a landscape built on beauty, art, and a profound sense of peace. But in the latter half of the 20th century, a shadow fell over this sun-drenched paradise. A primal fear, cold and sharp, began to seep into the soil, poisoning the idyllic dream. It started as a whisper, a local horror story, before it swelled into a national nightmare. They called him Il Mostro, the monster. For 17 years, from 1968 to 1985, the Monster of Florence haunted these hills. He was a phantom who hunted in the darkness, a predator with a singular terrifying focus: lovers. Couples seeking a moment of privacy in the quiet country lanes and scenic overlooks that surround the city became his prey. He would strike with brutal, lightning efficiency, turning their cars from sanctuaries of intimacy into blood-soaked tombs. He used the same weapon every time, a .22 caliber Beretta pistol, its report barely a pop in the vast silence of the Tuscan night. But the killing was only the beginning. What he did after his victims were dead is what elevated him from a mere murderer to a figure of pure mythological terror. With the precision of a surgeon, he would perform a grotesque ritual, a ritual of sexual mutilation on his female victims, a signature so horrific it seemed to defy all human comprehension. This was not a killer who hid in the shadows and reveled in his anonymity. He was a ghost who craved an audience. He taunted the authorities, playing a deadly game of cat and mouse with a police force that was completely hopelessly outmatched. He was Italy's Zodiac Killer, a modern-day Jack the Ripper stalking the birthplace of civilization. The fear he created was absolute. It changed the way people lived. The vibrant nightlife of a generation was extinguished. Young love, once a celebration of life, became a dance with death. Every parked car on a lover's lane was a potential coffin. Every rustle of leaves in the dark, the sound of approaching doom. This is the story of that terror. It is the story of the 16 men and women he murdered, of the families he destroyed, and of the decades-long labyrinthine manhunt that followed. It is a story of investigative failure on a colossal scale, of wrongful accusations, of bizarre trials, and of conspiracy theories so dark they stretch into the highest echelons of society. It is the story of a nation's obsession, and of a case that to this day remains a gaping wound in the Italian psyche. For in the heart of the Renaissance, a monster was born, and the silence he left behind in the Tuscan hills is a silence that has never truly been broken. Our story does not begin with the monster. It begins with a crime that for 6 long years was believed to be something else entirely. It begins with a domestic tragedy, a messy and violent affair that seemed all too common, a case the police thought they had solved in a matter of days. This was the original sin, the foundational murder from which all the later horror would spring. The failure to understand what truly happened on this night would allow a phantom to be born. The date was August 21, 1968. The location was the countryside near Signa, a small town just west of Florence. The night was warm and still, thick with the scent of the Tuscan earth. In a secluded spot near a local cemetery, a place where lovers often sought refuge from prying eyes, a white Alfa Romeo Giulietta was parked. Inside were 32-year-old Barbara Locci and her lover, a 29-year-old Sicilian bricklayer named Antonio Lobianco. Barbara Locci was a woman well known in the area. She was a striking mother of one, but she was trapped in a loveless marriage. To escape it, she cultivated a reputation. They called her La Paix, the bee, for the way she flitted from man to man. Her affair with Lobianco was passionate, open, and a source of constant gossip. On this particular night, they believed they were alone, wrapped in their own world. They were wrong. In the back seat of the Alfa Romeo, another soul was present, a silent witness to everything. It was Natalino, Barbara's 6-year-old son, fast asleep. He was the innocent heart of this sordid drama. a child who should have been safe in his bed at home. The silence of the night was shattered by a series of sharp, violent cracks. 8 shots, fired in quick succession from a distance of between 222 caliber pistol. The bullets tore through the car's thin metal and glass, finding their targets with deadly accuracy. Antonio Lobianco was killed instantly. Barbara Lecter, hit multiple times, lingered for a few moments before succumbing to her wounds. The killer did not hesitate. He did not stay to admire his work. He simply vanished back into the darkness from which he came, leaving behind a scene of carnage. For a time, the only sound was the gentle whisper of the wind and the quiet breathing of the sleeping child in the back seat. The next chapter of the night began shortly after midnight. A local farmer was startled by a frantic knocking at his door. When he opened it, he found a small, terrified boy, his face stained with tears. The boy could only repeat a few chilling words. "My daddy is here, he shot my mummy." Standing with the boy was his father, Stefano Meli, Barbara Lecter's husband. Meli, a Sardinian construction worker, claimed he had been driving by when he discovered the gruesome scene, found his son miraculously unharmed, and ran for help. It was a story that did not last the night. At the police station, under the pressure of interrogation, Stefano Meli's composure cracked. The grief of a husband who had just discovered his murdered wife gave way to the venomous rage of a man scorned. He confessed. He told the police he had followed his wife and her lover, his mind clouded by jealousy. He admitted to shooting them both, to ending the affair that had made him a laughingstock in their community. For the investigators, it was a textbook case, a crime of passion. The motive was clear, the confession was on paper, it seemed open and shut. They had their man. But this is where the simple story ends and the labyrinth begins. Because Stefano Meli's confession was not a straight line, it was a tangled web of accusations and denials. He was not a man taking sole responsibility. He was a man desperately trying to share the blame. He began to name names, pointing the finger at a close-knit group of his own relatives and acquaintances, a group that would become known as the Pista Sarda, the Sardinian Trail. He claimed he was not alone that night. He implicated Francesco Vinci, a man who had also been one of his wife's many lovers. He accused his own brothers-in-law. His story shifted and contorted with each telling. He was a pathetic, unreliable narrator, but the names he gave the police would send them down a rabbit hole for more than a decade, chasing shadows while the real killer remained free. And then there was the gun. The murder weapon was a .22 caliber Beretta. Meli claimed he had borrowed it from one of the men he accused. After the murders, he said he had thrown it into a nearby canal. The police searched, but the gun was never found. This single object, this small piece of steel, was the most crucial piece of evidence in the case, and it had vanished. The failure to recover that pistol was the single greatest mistake in the entire 17-year history of the Monster of Florence investigation. Stefano Meli was tried and convicted for the murders of his wife and her lover. He was sentenced to 14 years in prison. The other men he accused, the Sardinians, were investigated, but with no weapon and only the contradictory testimony of a convicted killer, they were eventually cleared for lack of evidence. The case of the 1968 double homicide was officially closed, filed away as a solved crime of passion, but the gun was not at the bottom of a canal. It was out there, in the world, waiting. It held the memory of the 8 shots it had fired. For 6 years it remained silent. The bloodstains in the Tuscan soil faded. A child grew up without his mother. A man sat in a prison cell. And the truth of what really happened that night near the cemetery in Siena lay dormant, a secret waiting to awaken. The original sin was not just the murder itself, but the lie that had been allowed to cover it, a lie that would soon unravel with terrifying consequences. 6 years. In the life of a community, it is long enough for a deep wound to scar over, for a local tragedy to fade into memory. Stefano Meli was in prison, serving his sentence. The case of the murdered lovers was officially closed. The Tuscan hills returned to their timeless state of tranquility. Young couples, seeking the privacy that only the countryside can offer, began to once again venture out into the night, their fears assuaged by the passage of time. The story of Barbara Lecter and Antonio Lobianco became just that, a story. But the instrument of their death the .22 caliber Beretta pistol, was not a story. It was real, and it had not been thrown into a canal. It had been kept, cleaned and cared for by a hand that was not Stefano Melli's. For 6 years it lay dormant, a patient predator waiting for the hunt to begin anew. The night of September 14, 1974, broke the silence. In a field near the town of Borgo San Lorenzo, just north of Florence, another car was parked in a lover's lane. Inside were 18-year-old Stefania Pettini and her 24-year-old fiancé Pasquale Gentilcore. They were a young couple, planning a future, stealing a moment of intimacy away from the world. The attack was a horrifying echo of the crime from 6 years prior. A volley of shots from a .22 caliber pistol, 8 bullets precisely fired, ending 2 young lives in an instant. But this time, the killer did not simply flee into the darkness. This time, he lingered. This time, he introduced the world to his true, monstrous nature. After killing the couple, the attacker dragged Stefania's body out of the car and into the adjacent vineyard. There, using a sharp knife, he performed a grotesque act of mutilation. He stabbed her 97 times in a frenzy of post-mortem violence. Then, with a chilling, surgical precision that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic stabbing, he excised her pubic region. It was a signature, a calling card of unimaginable horror. He had taken a trophy. The discovery of the crime scene sent a shockwave through the region. The brutality was one thing, but the ritualistic mutilation was something else entirely. It spoke of a motive that transcended jealousy or rage. This was something colder, something darker. Yet, incredibly, the investigators at the time failed to connect this new, horrific crime to the 1968 murders. The ballistics were not yet a priority. The files were in different jurisdictions, and the idea that a serial killer was at work was simply not on their radar. They treated it as a standalone atrocity, perhaps the work of a madman, a maniac, but not part of a pattern. The original sin remained buried, and then, just as suddenly as it had reappeared, the violence stopped. The killer and his Beretta retreated back into the shadows. For 7 more years, an eternity in a police investigation, there was nothing. No new attacks, no new clues. The 1974 murder remained a terrifying but isolated incident. The fear subsided once more. Life, as it always does, went on. The authorities were lulled into a false and deeply dangerous sense of security. This long pause is one of the killer's most profound mysteries. Where did the killer go? Was he in prison for some other crime? Did he move away? Or was he simply there, living a normal life, hiding in plain sight, exercising a terrifying degree of self-control? The silence itself was a form of psychological warfare. It allowed the terror of the last attack to fade just enough for complacency to set in, ensuring that when he returned, the shock and chaos would be absolute. His return came in the summer of 1981. It was not a single attack, but a blitzkrieg of terror. The monster, fully formed and confident, unleashed a fury that would cement his name in the annals of criminal history. On June 6th, in the hills of Scandicci, he struck again. 30-year-old Giovanni Danuccio and his 28-year-old girlfriend Stefania Caldini were murdered in their car. The method was identical, the .22 caliber Beretta, and once again the female victim was pulled from the vehicle and subjected to the same horrific, ritualistic mutilation. This time, the police could not ignore the pattern. The similarities to the 1974 crime were undeniable. They finally had a serial killer on their hands. Panic began to grip the public. The press, sensing a story of epic proportions, gave the unknown killer his name, Il Mostro di Firenze, the Monster of Florence. But the monster was just getting started. 4 months later, on October 22nd, he killed again. This time the victims were 26-year-old Stefano Baldi and his 24-year-old fiancée Susanna Canby. They were murdered in Calenzano, another lover's lane on the outskirts of Florence. The same gun, the same gruesome ritual. The signature was now unmistakable. The attack came just 2 days after the 1-year anniversary of Danuccio and Caldini's murder, a detail that suggested a chilling degree of planning and awareness. He was no longer just a killer, he was a performer, marking dates on a calendar of death. The summer of terror had not yet reached its crescendo. Just one day after the Baldi Cambi murders, the monster committed his most audacious act yet. He drove back to the scene of his previous crime, the spot where he had killed Giovanni Di Nuccio and Stefania Caldini 4 months earlier. There, he left a taunting message for the investigators, a sign that he was in complete control. The police were no longer just investigating a crime, they were being actively mocked by the perpetrator. The year of 1981 established the monster's reign of terror. He had killed 3 couples in less than 5 months. He had demonstrated his method, his signature, and his psychological dominance. The Tuscan hills were no longer a place of refuge, they were his hunting ground. For the people of Florence and for the thousands of young couples across the region, the world had changed forever. Every shadow now held a potential threat, and the quiet of the night was filled with a new and terrifying sound, the phantom report of a .22 caliber Beretta. The monster had truly awakened. The year 1982 dawned on a city holding its breath. The bloody summer and autumn of the previous year had left a permanent scar on the collective psyche of Florence. The name Il Mostro was no longer just a sensational newspaper headline, it was a palpable presence, a phantom that haunted the cypress-lined hills and lovers' lanes encircling the ancient city. The pressure on the Italian state, the police, the elite carabinieri, and the public prosecutor's office was immense and unrelenting. They were not merely investigating a series of murders, they were fighting a war against fear itself, and they were losing. The investigation, which had been a scattered and disjointed affair for over a decade, was finally centralized, its disparate threads gathered into one frantic, high-stakes manhunt. The first, and most critical, task was to find the link, the common denominator that would lead them to the killer. That link was not found on a dark country road, but under the sterile lights of a forensics laboratory. In a quiet room, away from the chaos of the press conferences and the terror of the public, ballistics technicians began their methodical work. It was a discipline of patience and precision, a world of microscopes and micrometers. They took the 9mm shell casings, the small brass artifacts of death, recovered from the 1981 murders of Di Nuccio and Caldini, and Baldi, and placed under a comparison microscope the unique signatures left on the primers and rims by the gun's firing pin and extractor claw were revealed. They were identical, the same weapon. This was expected. Next, they brought in the evidence from 1974, from the murder of Stefana Pettini and Pasquale Gentilicore. The technicians carefully aligned the casings. The result came back cold and absolute. A perfect match. The web of terror now officially spanned 7 years. It was here that a single inspired decision changed everything. Perhaps it was a senior investigator with a long memory, or a diligent clerk simply following procedure to its fullest extent. Whatever the reason, an order was given to retrieve the evidence from the archives of a case considered closed for 13 years, the 1968 murder of Barbara Locci and Antonio Lo Bianco. The crime for which Stefano Mele was serving a 14-year prison sentence. From a dusty evidence box, they pulled the shell casings that had sealed Mele's fate. They were placed under the lens alongside a casing from the most recent killing. The technician peered into the eyepiece, adjusted the focus, and felt a jolt of ice-cold adrenaline. The striations, the microscopic grooves and scratches, the gun's unique fingerprint, lined up perfectly. It was undeniable. It was impossible. It was the same gun. The implication of this discovery was a seismic shock that shattered the entire foundation of the investigation. It meant Stefano Mele, the man convicted of the first murder, was innocent of being the sole perpetrator. More importantly, it meant he could not be the monster, as he had been securely imprisoned during the subsequent killings. The 1968 murder was not a simple, self-contained crime of passion as everyone had believed. It was the genesis. It was the monster's first kill. The case that everyone thought was the solution was in fact the heart of the entire mystery. A wave of disbelief and horror washed over the investigators. For 13 years, the key to unmasking the monster had been sitting in an evidence locker, mislabeled as belonging to a solved case. This moment should have been a tabula rasa. a chance to wipe the slate clean and admit they were hunting a complete unknown, a faceless shadow who had been operating for nearly a decade and a half. But institutions under pressure rarely embrace the terrifying void of the unknown. Instead, they cling to what they think they know. And what they knew was that the 1968 crime had a cast of characters. It had names, faces, and established motives. The investigators, led by the energetic but headstrong prosecutor, found themselves at a critical fork in the road. One path led into the dark, uncharted territory of a phantom serial killer. The other led back to the familiar, sordid drama of the original crime. They chose the path that led backward. Their logic, born of desperation, was immediate and fatally flawed. If Stefano Mele didn't pull the trigger, but was present at the crime, then one of the men he had accused all those years ago must have been the real killer. The monster, they reasoned, was not a stranger. He was one of them. He was a Sardinian. This theory, which came to be known as the Pista Sarda, or the Sardinian Trail, was intoxicatingly convenient. It provided a pre-packaged narrative of jealousy, betrayal, and honor killings rooted in the old country's traditions. It transformed the terrifying random violence of a serial killer into a contained, understandable feud within a specific marginalized community. It gave the investigation a target. The full force of the Italian state now descended upon the Sardinian expatriate community around Florence. The focus of the manhunt pivoted with blinding speed. The key to unlocking the entire affair, they believed, was the man at the center of the original sin, Stefano Mele. He was brought out of prison and placed in the center of the storm. Mele was a man of low intelligence, semi-literate, and psychologically weak. He was a follower, a man who had spent his life on the lowest rungs of society. Now, suddenly, he was the most important man in Italy. He was questioned for hours, days, weeks. His testimony, which had always been a tangled mess of contradictions, became the gospel of the investigation. He was suggestible, eager to please, and terrified of his interrogators. He told them what he thought they wanted to hear, and what they wanted to hear were names. His accusations, ever shifting, centered on the men he had implicated from the very beginning. These were his relatives and his rivals, the men who had cuckolded him, chief among them his wife Barbara's many lovers. The investigators latched onto one name with particular intensity: Francesco Vinci. In their eyes, Vinci was the perfect suspect. He was known to have a volatile temper and a tough guy reputation. Crucially, he had been one of Barbara Loki's most recent lovers at the time of her death, providing them with the classic motive of jealousy. They constructed a scenario in which Vinci, perhaps with the help of others, had murdered Loki and her new lover, Lo Bianco. He had then taken the Beretta pistol as a trophy, keeping it for 6 years before his rage and sadism compelled him to begin killing again. The theory was a house of cards, built on the word of a proven liar and circumstantial evidence from a decade-old case. But the investigators pursued it with the zeal of converts. They placed Vinci and his brothers under heavy surveillance. They tapped their phones. They re-interviewed old witnesses, pressing them to confirm their narrative. The manhunt for the Monster of Florence had become a witch hunt against the Sardinian clan. In a series of dramatic, heavily publicized raids, Francesco Vinci was arrested, along with his brothers and another man named Giovanni Nelli. They were charged with conspiracy and murder. The prosecutor held a triumphant press conference announcing a major breakthrough. The monster, he assured the public, was a Sardinian, and he was now in custody. For a brief moment, it seemed the nightmare was over. The investigators, convinced of their own brilliance, celebrated their victory. But they had not caged the monster. They had merely arrested his shadow, while the real killer remained free, watching from the darkness as the authorities chased ghosts down a path of their own making. With their primary suspects behind bars, a fragile sense of calm settled over the prosecutor's office. The investigators, basking in the glow of media praise, believed they had broken the back of the conspiracy. They were convinced that the key to closing the case for good lay in pressuring the incarcerated Sardinians, in turning them against one another until one of them finally confessed and gave up the location of the murder weapon. The public, desperate for relief, began to believe that the reign of terror was finally at an end. But the Monster of Florence was not a man who could be defined by police theories or contained by their arrests. He was real, he was free, and he was about to deliver the most brutal and humiliating rebuttal imaginable. On the night of June 19, 1982, in the hills of Bosciano near Montespertoli, a Volkswagen Samba bus pulled into a secluded clearing. Inside were a young couple, 22-year-old Paolo Mainardi and his 19-year-old fiancée, Antonella Migliorini. They were just another pair of lovers seeking a moment of peace. The monster found them. He approached the vehicle in the darkness, and with the cold efficiency that was now his trademark, opened fire with the .22 caliber Beretta. But this time, something went wrong for the killer. Or perhaps something went differently. In the chaos of the attack, the dying Paolo Mainardi's foot slipped onto the accelerator. The van, its engine still running, lurched forward, rolling down the gentle slope of the hill for several yards before crashing into a tree. This unexpected movement may have startled the killer. He did not perform his usual ritual. He did not mutilate Antonella Migliorini. Instead, he vanished into the night, leaving behind a scene of confusion. Antonella was dead in the passenger seat, but Paolo, despite being shot 3 times, was still clinging precariously to life. The discovery of the van the next morning led to a horrifying scene. Paolo Mainardi died shortly after arriving at the hospital, unable to give any description of his attacker. The news of the Bosciano murders struck the investigation like a thunderbolt. It was a public and catastrophic refutation of their entire case. Their primary suspects, Francesco Vinci and the others, were all securely locked in their jail cells. They had an ironclad alibi provided by the state itself. Any rational investigation would have immediately collapsed the Sardinian Trail theory. It would have forced a painful public admission of error and a return to the very beginning. But the investigators had invested too much. Their reputations, their careers, and the credibility of the entire justice system in Florence were now inextricably tied to the pista sarda. To admit they were wrong was to admit they had no idea who or what they were hunting. And so they performed an act of breathtaking intellectual gymnastics. They refused to abandon their theory, they decided to expand it. The new narrative, born of pure desperation, was that the Bosciano murders were not the work of the monster, but of his accomplices. They argued that the rest of the Sardinian clan, the members who were still free, had committed this new double homicide for a single, cynical reason: to create an alibi for their imprisoned comrades. It was a baroque and convoluted explanation that defied logic. It required one to believe that these men were willing to commit a perfect copycat murder, risking life sentences themselves, just to spring their friends from jail on a lesser charge. It transformed the monster from a lone, terrifying phantom into the leader of a criminal syndicate that could order hits from behind bars. The theory was absurd on its face, but it was the only thing standing between the investigators and the terrifying abyss of the unknown. And so the tragic farce began. The manhunt did not widen, it simply shifted its focus to a different branch of the same family tree. The police, armed with their new, expanded conspiracy theory, began rounding up more Sardinians. They arrested a man named Salvatore Vinci, another of Barbara Locci's former lovers. Then they arrested his brother. The cycle became predictable and maddening. The police would fixate on a new Sardinian suspect, leak their name to the press, and build a circumstantial case around them. Then, inevitably, the monster would kill again. The next attack came on September 9, 1983, near the town of Giogoli. The victims were 2 young men from West Germany, 24-year-old Horst Wilhelm Meyer and 24-year-old Jens Uwe Roschieren. They were traveling through Italy in their Volkswagen bus, camping in the Tuscan hills. The murder of 2 men was a shocking deviation from the monster's established pattern of targeting heterosexual couples. The killer shot them both, but this time he performed his ritual on one of the male victims, Jens Uwe Rusch, excising a piece of flesh just as he had with his female victims. This act completely bewildered the investigators. It shattered their narrative of a killer motivated by a twisted form of sexual jealousy. How could a crime with 2 male victims fit into their theory of a Sardinian honor killing? They tried. They concocted flimsy, increasingly desperate explanations. Perhaps the killer mistook one of the long-hailed German men for a woman in the dark. Perhaps it was a message, but the truth was plain to see. Their theory was crumbling. With each new murder, the pista sarda became more untenable, more ludicrous. Yet they clung to it. Each time the Beretta spoke from the darkness, the investigators would be forced to release their current suspect due to the undeniable alibi, only to arrest another member of the Vinci or Melee clans a few weeks later. They were caught in a nightmarish loop, chasing ghosts of their own creation, while the real killer moved among them with total impunity, seemingly able to strike at will, knowing the authorities were looking in the wrong direction. Finally, after years of this fruitless circular investigation, the entire Sardinian Trail collapsed under its own weight. The evidence was non-existent. The only thing linking any of these men to the crimes was the rambling, contradictory, and often coerced testimony of Stefano Mele. The Italian judiciary, moving at its own glacial pace, began to dismantle the prosecutor's case. One by one, the Sardinians were released. Their lives had been shattered. They had been publicly branded as monsters, spent years in prison, and had their families torn apart, all for a crime they did not commit. The cost was immeasurable. By the mid-1980s, the investigation was in ruins. Years had been wasted. Countless resources had been squandered. The police and the prosecutor's office had lost all credibility, and most importantly, the Monster of Florence, having been given free rein for years, had become bolder, more confident, and was now preparing for the final, most audacious phase of his reign of terror. The Sardinian Trail had gone cold, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of ruined lives and the chilling realization that after all this time they were back at square one. They knew nothing. The monster was still out there, and his gun was still loaded. The collapse of the Sardinian Trail was not a moment of clarity for the investigation. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated chaos. The years spent chasing ghosts had not only allowed the real killer to continue his reign of terror unimpeded, but it had also eroded any trust the public had left in the authorities. The investigators were back at the very beginning, but it was worse than the beginning. They were now burdened with the shame of their catastrophic failure, the weight of ruined lives, and the chilling knowledge that the monster was smarter, more elusive, and more confident than they had ever imagined. The city of Florence and its surrounding province entered the bleakest period of the entire ordeal. The fear was no longer a creeping dread. It was a suffocating, ever-present reality that dictated the rhythms of daily life. A culture of terror took hold. The vibrant nightlife that had characterized the region for a generation was extinguished. Young people, the monster's chosen prey, lived under a self-imposed curfew. The act of falling in love, of seeking a moment of private intimacy, became synonymous with a death wish. The lovers' lanes, once symbols of romance and freedom, were now grimly referred to as slaughterhouses. They fell silent, abandoned to the rustling leaves and the oppressive darkness. Parents forbade their children from going out at night. Every news report of a stalled car on a country road sent a jolt of panic through the community. The monster had achieved what no army could. He had laid siege to the heart of Tuscany from within, turning its own beauty into a backdrop for horror. The police, stripped of their convenient theory, were adrift in an ocean of paranoia. They had no suspects, no leads, and no coherent strategy. The investigation devolved into a series of desperate reactionary measures. They launched massive, sweeping dragnets, questioning hundreds of people who fit the vaguest of profiles: loners, voyeurs, gun owners, anyone with a history of minor sexual offenses. They set up roadblocks and patrols, turning the idyllic countryside into a militarized zone. But they were hunting a phantom, and their nets consistently came up empty. They were looking for a monster in a land of shadows, and every shadow looked the same. For nearly a year after the murder of the two German men, the monster remained silent. This pause was not a reprieve, it was a form of torture. The silence stretched the city's nerves to the breaking point. Was he gone? Was he dead? Or was he simply waiting, savoring the fear, choosing his next moment with sadistic patience? The question hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The answer came on the night of July 29, 1984. In a wooded area near the town of Viccio, a place steeped in Tuscan history, the monster struck again. The victims were 21-year-old Claudio Stefanacci and his girlfriend, Pia Gilda Rontini. They were parked in Stefanacci's Fiat Panda on a dark, isolated road. The attack was a brutal confirmation that the nightmare was far from over. The killer fired his .22 Beretta, killing them both. He then pulled Pia Rontini's body from the car. What made this crime particularly heinous, sending a fresh wave of revulsion and fury across Italy, was Pia's age. She was only 14 years old, a child. The monster had crossed a new line, proving that there was no depth to which he would not sink. After murdering the young girl, he performed his ghastly ritual, mutilating her body before taking his trophy and disappearing. He also took her handbag, a small personal item that seemed like a minor detail at the time, but which hinted at the killer's growing arrogance, his desire to possess a piece of his victims' lives, not just their bodies. The Vecchio murders plunged the investigation into a new level of desperation. The case was now in the hands of a new lead magistrate, a formidable and determined woman named Silvia della Monica. She inherited a poisoned chalice, a case file filled with years of incompetence, a demoralized task force, and a public that was screaming for answers. She recognized that the old methods had failed. She began to explore new avenues, including the nascent field of criminal profiling, trying to build a psychological picture of the man they were hunting. But the monster left no psychological breadcrumbs, only a trail of bodies and shell casings. He was a void, a perfect predator, who moved through their world without leaving a trace, save for the carnage he wrought. The fear in Florence had reached its absolute peak. It seemed the monster was invincible, a supernatural force that could not be stopped. And he had one more act left to perform. An act of such chilling defiance that it would be his final, bloody signature on the history of the region. After the horror of the Vecchio murders, another long, agonizing silence descended upon Tuscany. For more than a year, the monster did not strike. This period of quiet was, in its own way, as terrifying as the attacks themselves. It created a landscape of crippling uncertainty. Hope, a fragile and dangerous commodity, began to tentatively bloom. Perhaps the killer had died. Perhaps he had been incarcerated for another, lesser crime. Perhaps, for some unknown reason, his terrible compulsion had simply faded. The summer of 1985 arrived, and with it the annual influx of tourists, many of whom were blissfully unaware of the dark cloud under which the region was living. They saw only the rolling hills, the historic villas, and the golden sunlight. They did not see the shadows. In early September, a young French couple, 36-year-old Jean-Michel Craveitzvili and 25-year-old Nadine Morillo, were making their way through this idyllic landscape. They were on holiday, camping, sleeping under the stars. They pitched their small tent in a secluded clearing near the town of San Cassiano, a spot not far from where other couples had been murdered. They were outsiders, innocents who had wandered into the heart of the hunting ground. On the night of September 8, 1985, the silence was broken for the final time. The monster found them. The circumstances of this attack were different, forcing the killer to adapt his methods. There was no car to trap them in, only the thin nylon walls of a tent. He approached in the darkness, likely waiting until they were asleep. He slashed open the tent with a knife before opening fire with the .22 caliber Beretta. Jean-Michel Craveitzvili was shot and killed as he tried to flee. Nadine Morillo was murdered inside the tent. The killer then dragged her body out into the clearing. What he did next represented the apogee of his savagery and the ultimate expression of his grotesque signature. He did not perform the same mutilation as before. This time, with a horrifying, calculated precision, he excised her entire left breast. He then took her purse, another personal trophy, before melting back into the Tuscan night for the last time. The discovery of the gruesome scene the next day confirmed the city's worst fears. The monster was not gone, he was still there, and his cruelty had reached a new, unimaginable level. The investigation was thrown into overdrive. The murder of foreign tourists brought international attention and pressure. The Italian state looked powerless, humiliated by a phantom they could not identify, let alone catch. But the monster had not yet delivered his coup de grace. His final act was not one of violence, but of pure, unadulterated psychological warfare. It was a message, directed not at the public, but at the very heart of the state that was hunting him. A few days after the murders, a simple white envelope arrived at the public prosecutor's office in Florence. It was addressed by name to Silvia della Monica, the lead magistrate on the case. In an office filled with mundane legal correspondence, it would have looked like any other piece of mail. An assistant likely opened it. The contents would have seemed confusing at first, perhaps some strange discolored piece of organic matter. Then the realization would have dawned, followed by a wave of pure, sickening horror. Inside the envelope was the breast of Nadine Moreau. This act transcended murder. It was a gesture of such profound contempt, such absolute audacity, that it left the entire country reeling. The monster was no longer just killing people in the dark, he was now communicating directly with his pursuers. He was taking a piece of his victim, a piece of his crime, and mailing it to the chief law enforcement officer on his case as a trophy and a taunt. The message was unambiguous, a declaration of ultimate power. You are hunting me, but I am so far beyond your reach that I can send you a piece of my handiwork through the post. You are not the hunter, I am. And you are nothing. For Silvia della Monica and her team, it was a moment of utter violation. The killer had breached the walls of their offices, of their investigation, and had made it sickeningly personal. They were no longer just investigators, they were the monster's audience. He was performing for them, mocking their failure on a stage of his own creation. The act galvanized them, but it also underscored the terrifying nature of the intelligence they were up against. This was not a mindless brute. This was a calculating, patient, and deeply malevolent individual who savored not only the act of killing, but the terror it inspired. This was the Monster of Florence's final act. After mailing his grotesque package, he stopped. The killings which had terrorized the region for 17 years came to an abrupt and inexplicable end. The Beretta was never fired in anger again. The silence that followed was different. It was not the tense quiet of a pause between attacks. It was the deep, unnerving silence of a void. The great unanswered question settled over the investigation. Why? Why did he stop? Did he die of natural causes? Was he finally imprisoned for an unrelated crime? Or did he simply make a conscious decision to retire, to put away his knife and his gun and live out the rest of his days as a quiet neighbor, a face in the crowd, satisfied with his 17-year reign of terror? The active hunt for a killer was over. The cold, desperate search for a ghost was about to begin. The final, taunting message sent to Silvia della Monica in 1985 marked the end of an era. The Monster of Florence, after 17 years of bloodshed, fell silent. But his silence was not an absence, it was a presence. It was a suffocating void that settled over the Tuscan hills, a constant, gnawing reminder of a mystery that had defeated the Italian state. The years that followed were a strange and bitter epilogue to the terror. The acute, stabbing panic of the murder years slowly subsided, replaced by a chronic societal ache. The case grew cold, not just in the investigative sense, but in the public consciousness. It became a part of the region's folklore, a modern horror story told alongside ancient legends. A permanent scar on the landscape, the media moved on to other headlines. The tourists returned, and a new generation of young lovers began, cautiously, to reclaim the night. But for the investigators, the case never closed. It festered. It was a monument to their failure, a labyrinth of dead-end theories and ruined reputations. The files grew thick with reports on Sardinian feuds, satanic cults, and phantom-like figures, all of it amounting to nothing. The pressure from Rome and from their own consciences was immense. They needed a resolution. The country needed a face for its fear. By the dawn of the 1990s, with the investigation effectively moribund, a new team of prosecutors and carabinieri took a fresh look at the mountain of evidence. They made a crucial decision: to abandon the Baroque conspiracy theories that had led them astray for so long. The idea of a Sardinian clan committing murders to free their relatives or a sophisticated cult ordering hits had collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. They decided to return to the most fundamental and most terrifying possibility, that the monster was a single man. They began to work with criminologists and psychologists, a practice still relatively new in Italy. to build a profile of the killer. The picture that emerged was stark and specific. He would be a local, a man who knew the twisting country roads, the secluded clearings, and the rhythms of rural life intimately. He would likely be a man of low education but high native cunning, a predator who understood his environment perfectly. His psychology would be defined by a deep, misogynistic rage, and he would likely have a prior history of violent, sexualized crime. He would be a social outcast, a man living on the periphery, perhaps feared or disliked by his neighbors, but ultimately overlooked, his true nature hidden behind a mask of rustic simplicity. They were no longer hunting for a mastermind. They were hunting for a peasant. The problem was that this profile fit thousands of men in the Tuscan countryside. They needed a catalyst, a specific piece of information to narrow the search. That catalyst arrived in the most mundane way imaginable, through the post. An anonymous letter, one of thousands the police had received over the decades, landed on a desk. Most such letters were the work of cranks or people settling petty scores, but this one was different. It was detailed, coherent, and it pointed a trembling finger at a man named Pietro Pacciani, a farmer living in Mercatal Valdepesa, a town located at the very epicenter of the murder zone. The letter described Pacciani as a brutish, violent man, a figure of local terror, and listed his past crimes. For the exhausted investigators, reading the letter was like watching a ghost take shape before their eyes. They pulled Pacciani's file, and as they read, a sense of profound, chilling certainty began to grow. It was as if the man had been created by a novelist to be the perfect suspect. Born in 1925 in the rural poverty of the Mugello, Pacciani's life was a litany of violence and resentment. Known locally as Il Vampa, dialect word suggesting a wild, untamable, almost feral nature, he was a man who seemed to exist in a state of perpetual rage against the world. He was notoriously miserly, physically powerful, and possessed a crude, intimidating charisma that he used to bully and dominate everyone around him. His neighbors spoke of him in hushed tones, telling stories of his explosive temper and his bizarre antisocial behavior. But it was his official criminal record that made him leap off the page. In 1951, when Pacciani was 26 years old, he had committed a crime that was a dark premonition of the monster's entire career. He had caught his fiancée, Miranda Bulli, in a secluded spot with a rival, a traveling salesman named Severino Bonini. In a paroxysm of jealousy, Pacciani ambushed them. He stabbed Bonini 40 times with a knife, killing him in a frenzy of violence. Then, in an act of supreme sadism, with Bonini's body lying beside them, he turned to his fiancée and brutally raped her. The crime was a horrifying tableau, a couple targeted in a lover's lane, a knife used with extreme prejudice, and a grotesque act of sexual violence fused with murder. It was the monster's entire modus operandi in embryonic form. For this, Pacciani served 13 years in prison, after which he returned to society, a man who had already proven his capacity for the most monstrous acts. His release from prison did not temper his violence, it merely domesticated it. He married a timid, submissive woman named Angiolina Manni, and they had 2 daughters, Rosanna and Graziella. The family farmhouse, a dilapidated stone building on the outskirts of Mercatali, became Pacciani's personal fiefdom, a private hell where he ruled as an absolute and terrifying tyrant. He was repeatedly reported and convicted for beating Angiolina, often for the most trivial of reasons, but the true horror was reserved for his daughters. As they entered adolescence, he began to subject them to a relentless campaign of incestuous sexual abuse that would last for years. It was a secret kept locked away by fear, a testament to his ability to maintain a double life, the coarse but unremarkable farmer to the outside world, the sadistic monster behind closed doors. This history of sustained hidden sexual violence was, for the investigators, a crucial piece of the puzzle. It proved he was a man capable of the kind of profound psychological compartmentalization required of a serial killer. By 1991, the investigators were convinced. They had their man. The profile fit, the history fit, the geography fit. They placed Pacciani under intense surveillance, meticulously documenting his every move, searching for any slip-up. Finally, they made their move. A massive contingent of carabinieri descended on the farm in Mercatale, The search of Pacciani's property was a journey into the squalor of his mind. The house was a hoarder's den, choked with garbage, pornography, farming equipment, and decades of worthless junk. For days, forensic teams in hazmat suits sifted through this chaotic landscape, searching for a tangible link to the 17-year reign of terror. They found what they were looking for, or at least what they believed they were looking for. The first discovery was made in the soft earth of Pacciani's vegetable garden. An officer running a metal detector over the soil got a hit. He carefully dug down and unearthed a single, unfired .22 caliber bullet. It was perfectly preserved. When it was taken to the lab, the technicians identified it as a Winchester. With the letter H stamped on the base of the casing, it was the exact same brand, the same series, the same rare type of ammunition that had been used to kill 16 people. To the prosecution, this was the equivalent of finding the Holy Grail. It was the physical evidence that tied the suspect to the weapon, the single thread connecting this brutish farmer to the entire string of murders. The second key piece of evidence was a notebook, a cheap diary in which Pacciani scrawled his thoughts. It was filled with crude drawings, rambling notes, and bizarre symbols. To some, it was the meaningless doodling of a semi-literate old man. To the investigators, it was a treasure map of his crimes. They claimed to find sketches that resembled license plates of the victims' cars and crude maps of murder locations. The most damning item, however, was something Pacciani himself tried to conceal. During the search, he was caught attempting to hide a small block of wood with a piece of canvas tacked to it. When the police seized it, they found it was a crude, homemade art object. On the canvas was a sketch, and underneath it, a German word, Republik. The victims at Giogoli had been German. Was this a grotesque trophy? Armed with the bullet, the notebook, the art object, and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence of Pacciani's life and character, the state made its move. Pietro Pacciani was arrested and formally charged with 14 of the 16 murders attributed to the Monster of Florence. The news detonated like a bomb in Italian society. After nearly 3 decades of fear and failure, they finally had him. The press published his photograph, a scowling, defiant, weather-beaten face that seemed to radiate pure malevolence. It was the perfect face for the monster. A collective sigh of relief swept the nation. The nightmare was over. The trial could now begin, a grand spectacle of justice that promised to finally close the book on Italy's most terrifying mystery. But the book of the Monster of Florence was not so easily closed. The trial would not be an epilogue. It would be a new chapter, one that would introduce even more doubt, more confusion, and more enduring questions. The trial of Pietro Pacciani, which opened in Florence in the spring of 1994, was more than a legal proceeding. It was a national exorcism. It was the culmination of 30 years of fear, failure, and frustration. A spectacle designed to give a name and a face to the phantom that had haunted the Tuscan hills. The courtroom became a theater and every seat was filled. The Italian media descended in a frenzy, broadcasting every detail to a rapt nation. The public, pre-convinced of his guilt, watched as the man they knew as Il Vampa was led into the cage reserved for the most dangerous defendants. He was not the cowering figure many expected. He was defiant, his eyes scanning the room with a mixture of contempt and confusion. He was a 70-year-old farmer, weathered and coarse, and he was about to become the star of the most sensational trial in modern Italian history. The prosecution, led by a team confident they had their man, built their case on 2 powerful pillars: Pacciani's character and the physical evidence recovered from his home. The first pillar was a narrative of his life. They painted a portrait of a man defined by violence, resentment, and a profound misogynistic rage. They began with the 1951 murder of Severino Bonini and the subsequent rape of his own fiancée, presenting it as the monster's origin story, a foundational act of brutality that set the pattern for everything to come. They brought his wife and daughters to the stand, who gave harrowing, tearful testimony about the decades of beatings and the horrific, systematic incest he had inflicted upon his children. The prosecution's message was clear. This was not just a violent man, this was a monster in human form, a man whose entire existence was a testament to his capacity for cruelty. They argued that the leap from raping his daughters in a squalid farmhouse to mutilating strangers in the dark was not a large one. Then came the second pillar, the physical evidence. The prosecution presented their findings with theatrical flair. The centerpiece of their case was the single, unfired Winchester Series H bullet found in Pacciani's garden. An expert testified that it was from the same rare stock as the bullets used in the murders. They held it up as the undeniable link, the smoking bullet that connected Pacciani's world to the world of the monster. They presented the rambling, chaotic notebooks with prosecutors pointing to specific scribbles and claiming they were cryptic references to the crimes, a series of numbers that mirrored a victim's license plate, a crude drawing that supposedly depicted a murder scene, and they presented the Republic art block, arguing it was a grotesque trophy, a memento taken from the German victims at Jogali, proof of Pacciani's need to keep souvenirs of his conquests. The prosecution rested its case, confident that the combination of Pacciani's monstrous character and this collection of seemingly damning evidence was insurmountable. The defense, however, saw not a solid case but a house of cards built on speculation and prejudice. Their strategy was to dismantle the prosecution's case piece by piece, exposing the circumstantial nature of every single claim. They attacked the character argument first. Yes, Pacciani was a terrible man, they conceded. He was a wife-beater, an incestuous father, a convicted killer from 40 years prior, but being a domestic monster did not automatically make him the Monster of Florence. They portrayed him as an ignorant, brutish peasant, a product of a harsh and unforgiving rural world, but not the cunning, meticulous, and forensically aware serial killer who had evaded capture for 17 years. The defense then turned its fire on the physical evidence. It was here that the state's case began to crumble. The smoking bullet was their primary target. They pointed out the obvious damning flaw. The bullet was unfired and found in pristine condition, buried shallowly in a garden. Why, they asked, would a killer as careful as the monster, who had never left a single clue at any crime scene, be so careless as to keep a single incriminating bullet and bury it in his own garden, a place it could easily be found? It made no sense. They floated a more sinister explanation. The bullet was planted. They argued that the police, under immense pressure to solve the case, had framed Pacciani, planting the one piece of evidence they needed to secure a conviction. They gave the same treatment to the rest of the evidence. The notebooks, they argued, were not the diary of a killer, but the incoherent ramblings of a semi-literate old man. The prosecution's interpretations were exercises in confirmation bias, desperate attempts to see patterns where none existed. The Republic art block was dismissed as meaningless. Pacciani was a hoarder of junk. The object was just one more piece of worthless flotsam in the sea of squalor that was his home. One by one, the defense chipped away at the prosecution's certainties, replacing them with doubt. The trial reached its theatrical climax when Pietro Pacciani himself took the stand. His performance was a spectacle of defiance and vulgarity. He did not act like a man fighting for his life. He acted like a man deeply offended by the inconvenience. He yelled at the prosecutors, calling them names and accusing them of framing him. He told crude, inappropriate jokes. He spoke in a thick, nearly incomprehensible rural dialect, presenting himself as a simple man of the earth, a contadino who was being persecuted by sophisticated city lawyers he could not understand. At one point, when asked about his sexual habits, he famously declared he was just a snack lover, a phrase that would later take on a dark and ironic significance. His belligerent, oafish performance was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it reinforced the prosecution's image of him as a brutish, unpleasant man. On the other, it made him seem utterly incapable of the kind of meticulous planning and stealth that defined the Monster of Florence. Could this loud, crude, buffoonish figure really be the silent phantom of the hills? In the end, the jury was faced with a choice. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a deeply unsympathetic defendant with a history of horrific violence, and the immense pressure of a nation demanding a conviction. The doubts raised by the defense were significant, but perhaps the desire for closure was stronger. In November 1994, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty. Pietro Pacciani was convicted of the murders and sentenced to multiple life terms. A wave of relief washed over Italy. The monster had been caged. Justice, it seemed, had finally been done. But the story was far from over. Pacciani's lawyers immediately filed an appeal. The case went to the appellate court, a higher body of professional judges who would re-examine the evidence without the circus-like atmosphere of the first trial. And in a stunning reversal that threw the entire country into confusion, the appellate court acquitted Pietro Pacciani in February 1996. The judges issued a scathing report concluding that the evidence against him was flimsy and contradictory. They cited the lack of a credible motive and, most importantly, declared that Pacciani was simply not the man who had committed the crimes. The man Italy had celebrated locking away was now, improbably, a free man. The acquittal created chaos. The prosecution, humiliated and furious, refused to accept defeat. They appealed the acquittal to Italy's highest court, the Court of Cassation in Rome. In a final, dizzying legal reversal, the High Court sided with the prosecution. In December 1996, they annulled the acquittal, citing a vacuum of logic, and ordered that Pietro Pacciani must stand trial all over again. The legal system had tied itself in knots. Pacciani was guilty, then innocent, and now once again the accused monster. The retrial was scheduled, and the nation prepared for another round of the Pacciani circus. But the Monster of Florence case had one last bizarre twist to deliver. On the morning of February the 22nd, 1998, just before his new trial was set to begin, Pietro Pacciani was found dead. He was discovered in his home, lying face down on the floor, his trousers pulled down around his ankles. His asthma medication, which he desperately needed, was on a nearby table just out of reach. The official cause of death was ruled to be a heart attack, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. Had the stress of the endless legal battles finally killed him? Or was it something more sinister? Had he been murdered by the real killer or killers to prevent him from talking at his new trial? His death left an unfillable void at the center of the case. The man who was supposed to be the final answer had died, leaving behind only more questions. The Pacciani saga was over, but the mystery of the Monster of Florence was more alive and more confusing than ever before. The sudden, sordid death of Pietro Pacciani in February of 1998 should have been the end of the story, but in the labyrinth of the Monster of Florence case, every ending was just a new, more confusing beginning. Pacciani's death left a gaping hole at the center of the investigation. He was the man the state had convicted, then acquitted, and was about to prosecute all over again. He was their monster, their grand theory, the focal point of years of work. With his heart stopped on the dirty floor of his home, the prosecution was left with nothing but the wreckage of a case that had collapsed twice. The public, whipped into a frenzy of confusion by the legal whiplash, had no closure. The specter of the monster, which they believed had been captured, was once again faceless, adrift in the Tuscan hills. For the prosecutors, letting the case die with Pacciani was not an option. It would be a final, humiliating admission of defeat. They had to salvage something from the ashes. Their desperation led them to a stroke of perverse genius. They decided to resurrect a phrase Pacciani himself had uttered during his trial. When questioned about his crude sexual appetites, the belligerent farmer had dismissed them with a vulgar shrug, declaring, "I am a friend of the snacks," or more colloquially, "I'm just a snack lover." It was a piece of coarse, rustic bravado, a way of describing his voyeuristic habits. The prosecution, in a brilliant act of narrative jujitsu, seized this phrase and repurposed it. It was no longer a personal admission, it was the name of a gang. Pacciani wasn't a lone pervert, he was the leader of the Compagnie di Merende, the Friends of the Snack Bar. The theory of the lone wolf killer was dead. The theory of the wolf pack was about to be born. The investigation, which had been fixated solely on Pacciani, now pivoted with remarkable speed. If Pacciani was the leader, who were his accomplices? The prosecutors began scrutinizing his circle of associates, a small group of men on the fringes of society, linked by poverty, ignorance, and a shared fondness for cheap wine and crude entertainment. The first and most obvious target was a man named Mario Vanni. Vanni, a retired postman, was Pacciani's closest friend. He was a loud, boorish figure, known for his explosive temper and a mouth that spewed a constant stream of profanities and boasts. During Pacciani's trial, Vanni had been called as a witness and had created a memorable scene, screaming at his friend in the courtroom, "Pacciani, if you don't talk, you're not even a man!" To the prosecution, this wasn't just an outburst. It was the threat of an accomplice, terrified that the leader of their pack was about to crack. Vanni, with his physical strength and aggressive personality, was cast as the gang's muscle, the enforcer who helped the aging Pacciani overpower his young victims. But Vanni was defiant and uncooperative. They needed more. They needed someone on the inside, someone weak enough to be broken, someone who could give them the narrative they so desperately needed to build. They found their man in a pathetic marginal figure named Giancarlo Lotti. Known as Giancarlo, Lotti was the definition of a follower. He was a chronic alcoholic, a pathological liar, and a man of such low intelligence that he was easily manipulated. He had a long criminal record for petty crimes, and was known for telling wild, unbelievable stories to anyone who would listen. Lotti had also been a witness at the Pacciani trial, where he had provided a flimsy and ultimately discarded alibi for the farmer on the night of one of the murders. He was a man who lived in Pacciani's shadow, desperate for the approval of the more dominant men in his circle. To the investigators, he was the perfect weak link. The police brought Lotti in for questioning. What followed was not a single dramatic confession, but a slow, methodical process of psychological demolition. Over the course of dozens of interviews and interrogations, stretching on for weeks, they chipped away at him. Lotti was terrified. He was facing his own legal troubles for perjury and other minor offenses. The investigators had him cornered, and they presented him with a choice: remain a minor suspect facing jail time, or become the state's star witness and save himself. They began by asking him about the Mirandi, the voyeuristic excursions. At first, Lotti was hesitant, but he eventually began to talk. He spun lurid tales of the group Pacciani, Vanni himself, and another man named Fernando Pucci, piling into a car, fueled by wine, and driving through the hills at night. He described them parking near known lovers' lanes, creeping through the woods and spying on couples. This part of his story was, in its sad, sordid way, believable. It fit the known characters of the men involved. It was the confession of a group of pathetic peeping toms. But the investigators needed more than voyeurism. They needed murder. And so they pushed. They presented Lotti with the forensic evidence, the crime scene photos, the dates, the locations. They pointed out the inconsistencies in his stories, cornering him in his own lies. Lotti, desperate to please his interrogators and extricate himself from his legal jeopardy, began to change his story. He started to remember more. The line between watching and participating began to blur. The breakthrough for the prosecution came when Lotti finally placed himself at the scene of a murder. He began by describing the 1984 murder of Pierontini and Claudio Stefanacci. He claimed he was there, hiding in the bushes, watching in terror. He described Pacciani in a fit of rage, committing the murders alone. This was a pivotal moment. Lotti had crossed the Rubicon. He had admitted to being present. From that point on, the floodgates opened. With each new interrogation, his role and the role of the others grew. He was no longer just a passive observer. He was a reluctant accomplice, a terrified lookout, a man forced to participate by the monstrous Pacciani and the brutish Vanni. He began to confess to being present at not one, but 4 of the double homicides. The pathetic peeping Tom had transformed himself, under the intense pressure of interrogation, into the Zapruder of the Tuscan hills, the man who had secretly filmed it all in his mind. The prosecution had found its narrator, and Giancarlo Lotti, the village liar, was about to tell the story that would officially solve the case of the Monster of Florence. With Giancarlo Lotti, their star witness, now pliable and cooperative, the prosecution began to construct the official, final narrative of the Monster of Florence crimes. Lotti's confession was not a simple statement. It was a sprawling, epic tale of sordid evenings and explosive violence. A story he refined and expanded with each interrogation. He laid out a horrifyingly simple, almost mechanical division of labor for the friends of the snack bar. Pietro Pacciani's Il Vampa was always the leader, the instigator, and the principal actor. It was Pacciani, Lotti claimed, who carried the infamous .22 Beretta. It was Pacciani who fired the shots, and it was Pacciani alone who performed the grotesque ritual mutilations on the female victims, his face a mask of cold fury. Mario Vanni, the profane and aggressive postman, was cast as the brutal accomplice. According to Lotti, Vanni's role was one of physical intimidation and control. In the murders where the victims were outside their car, Lotti claimed Vanni would help restrain the male victim while Pacciani attacked the female. He was the muscle, the heavy, the one who ensured there was no escape. And what was Lotti's role in this theater of horror? He was the lookout, the reluctant wheelman, the terrified observer. In his telling, he was a pathetic figure, paralyzed by fear, forced to watch these atrocities unfold by the domineering Pacciani. He described hiding in the bushes, vomiting from fear, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel. It was a self-serving narrative that painted him as a victim, almost as much as the couples who were murdered. To bolster Lotti's increasingly elaborate story, the investigators needed corroboration. They found it in the fourth and most tragic member of the snack bar group, a man named Fernando Pucci. Pucci was an elderly, intellectually disabled man who suffered from severe health problems. He was another peripheral figure in Pacciani's circle, often the butt of his cruel jokes. When the police brought Pucci in, they found a man who was confused, terrified, and eager to please. Speaking from his deathbed, Pucci gave a series of statements that seemed at first to confirm Lotti's account. He spoke of the Mirande, the voyeuristic trips. Crucially, he claimed to have been present at the final murder in 1985, the killing of the French tourists. He described Pacciani and Vanni committing the crime, his story echoing the key details of Lotti's confession. The prosecution now had two witnesses. The case, which had been built on nothing, now seemed to stand on the testimony of two insiders. The trial of Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti began in 1997. It was a bizarre and often farcical affair, a pale imitation of the grand Pacciani trial. Lotti, now the state's star witness, took the stand and dutifully recited the story the prosecution had so carefully constructed. He recounted the details of 4 double homicides, his testimony a blend of lurid detail and pathetic self-pity. Opposite him was Mario Vanni, who provided the trial's only real fireworks. He was pure defiance, a volcano of rage and profanity. He screamed at Lotti from the defendant's cage, calling him a liar, an idiot, a drunk. He insulted the judges and the prosecutors. His explosive outbursts, intended to show his innocence, often had the opposite effect, painting him as exactly the kind of violent, uncontrollable man Lotti described. The defense lawyers faced an impossible task. Their entire strategy rested on discrediting the state's 2 key witnesses. They hammered Lotti on the stand, pointing out the dozens of inconsistencies in his story. His account of the 1985 murder, for instance, contradicted the physical evidence in several key ways. He described the victim's tent as being a different color and shape from the actual one. He got the sequence of the gunshots wrong. The defense argued that Lotti was a pathological liar, a man who had simply memorized details fed to him by the police and embellished them with his own sordid imagination. They argued he was trading a fabricated story for his freedom. They attacked Pucci's testimony as even less reliable, the confused ramblings of a dying, disabled man who was being manipulated by the authorities. But it was not enough. The jury, perhaps weary of the endless uncertainty and desperate for a conclusion, chose to believe the confession. In 1998, Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti were found guilty. Vanni was sentenced to life in prison, Lotti to 26 years for his role as an accomplice. The state had its convictions. The Monster of Florence case was for the second time officially solved. The headlines declared that the friends of the snack bar had been brought to justice. The file was stamped closed. Yet, for anyone who had followed the case closely, this conclusion felt hollow, a deeply unsatisfying fiction. It satisfied almost no one. The theory was riddled with holes so large you could drive a Fiat Panda through them. The entire case rested on the word of Giancarlo Lotti, a man whose testimony was demonstrably unreliable, and the deathbed whispers of Fernando Pucci. There was not a single piece of new physical evidence, no fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon. The Beretta pistol, the single object that could definitively prove the killer's identity remained missing. Furthermore, the snack bar theory failed to answer the most fundamental questions. Why did this group of aging voyeurs suddenly escalate to serial murder? Lotti offered no coherent motive beyond Pacciani's inexplicable rage. Why did they kill with such brutal, ritualistic precision for 17 years, only to stop abruptly in 1985? The theory provided no answer, and how could this bumbling group of drunks, a loudmouth postman, a village idiot, and a disabled old man, led by a brutish farmer, have carried out 16 perfect murders, never leaving a single forensic trace, outsmarting the entire Italian police apparatus for nearly 2 decades? It begged belief. The official solution felt less like the discovery of a hidden truth and more like an act of narrative convenience, a story crafted by the prosecution to put an end to their most embarrassing and protracted failure. The case was closed, but the truth felt further away than ever. The convictions had created a legal resolution, but they had not brought clarity. They had only added another layer of doubt and suspicion to the enduring mystery of the Monster of Florence. The convictions of Mario Vanni and Giancarlo Lotti should have brought peace to Tuscany. The state had declared the case solved, the book closed, but for many, the official solution felt like a lie. It was a story so full of contradictions and implausibilities that it created more questions than it answered. The idea that a gang of semi-literate, alcoholic voyeurs could have carried out a 17-year campaign of perfect murders was, to put it mildly, difficult to believe. The friends of the snack bar theory simply could not explain the most fundamental aspects of the case: the ritualistic precision of the mutilations, the killer's uncanny ability to evade capture, and the abrupt, inexplicable end to the killings in 1985. The official narrative was a leaky vessel, and through its many holes, a darker, more terrifying theory began to seep. This theory had always existed on the fringes of the investigation, whispered in police corridors and journalistic circles, but after the unsatisfying conviction of the snack bar friends, it moved from the fringe to the center. It was known as the second-level theory, or the theory of the mandanti, the masterminds. It proposed a radical and chilling reinterpretation of the entire saga. What if Pietro Pacciani and his brutish friends were not the architects of the horror, but merely its instruments? What if they were the hired hands, the disposable grunts, who carried out the killings for a wealthy, educated, and powerful group operating in the shadows? What if the friends of the snack bar were just the first level, and the real monsters were on a second, unseen level above them? This theory, at its core, sought to answer the one question the official solution ignored: the motive. Why the bizarre mutilations? Why the excision of a pubic triangle from one victim, a left breast from another? The snack bar theory offered no reason beyond Pacciani's inscrutable rage. The second-level theory provided a motive that was as elegant as it was horrifying. The body parts were not trophies for a peasant farmer, they were deliverables. They were specific items, ordered and collected for a purpose. That purpose, the theory claimed, was black magic. Pacciani and his crew were not just killers, they were grave robbers for a satanic or esoteric cult, a secret society of wealthy professionals who used the human trophies in their dark rituals. Suddenly, the random cruelty of the crimes snapped into a coherent, if monstrous, pattern. The killings were not about sexual frustration or random violence. They were about harvesting. This explained the precision. The killers weren't just mutilating bodies in a frenzy, they were surgically removing specific items, like a butcher filling an order. This also explained the baffling inconsistencies in the killer's profile. How could a crude peasant like Pacciani operate with such forensic sophistication? The second-level theory suggested he didn't. The masterminds, the educated professionals, could have provided the logistical support, the planning, the knowledge of police procedure, and perhaps even the choice of victims, guiding their crude instruments with an unseen hand. Investigators and journalists who pursued this theory began to look for connections between Pacciani's world of rural squalor and the world of Tuscany's elite. They began to focus on a handful of mysterious figures. One was a pharmacist from the town of San Casciano, a man named Francesco Calamandre. He was rumored to have connections to esoteric groups and was known to associate with some of the snack bar members. Witnesses claimed to have seen him speaking with Pacciani. Was he a link between the two levels, a middleman who passed instructions from the cult to the killers? But the most compelling and enigmatic figure in the second-level theory was a man from Perugia, a respected gastroenterologist named Francesco Narducci. Narducci was wealthy, educated, and came from a prominent family. He also had a secret. He was allegedly involved in an esoteric sect and had a fascination with the macabre. And he was connected to the Monster of Florence case by the most tantalizing clue of all: timing. On October 8, 1985, just 1 month after the monster's final murder, the body of Francesco Narducci was pulled from Lake Trasimeno, near his home in Perugia. His death was officially ruled an accident or a suicide, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. His body was found in a place he had no reason to be, and there were inconsistencies in the autopsy report. For proponents of the cult theory, this was the key that unlocked the entire mystery. The murders had stopped in September of 1985. A month later, one of the alleged masterminds, the man who supposedly commissioned the human trophies for his rituals, was dead. The connection was too perfect to be a coincidence. The theory proposed that Narducci's death, whether by accident, suicide, or murder at the hands of his co-conspirators, shattered the cult. With the client gone, the services of Pacciani and his crew were no longer required. The demand for human flesh had ceased, and so the supply chain of murder was shut down. It was a single, dramatic event that explained the 17 years of terror and the 40 years of silence that followed. The monster didn't retire or get old. The monster stopped killing because his master had died. This dark, conspiratorial theory, while never proven in court, provided a chillingly complete narrative, one that accounted for all the lingering inconsistencies of the case and painted a picture of evil far more profound and organized than a simple gang of rural voyeurs. The theory of a satanic cult orchestrating the Monster of Florence murders would have remained in the realm of speculative fiction, were it not for a dogged prosecutor in Perugia named Giuliano Minghini. Intrigued by the deeply suspicious circumstances surrounding the 1985 death of Dr. Francesco Narducci, Minghini opened a new investigation. He did not believe the official story that Narducci had accidentally drowned or committed suicide. He believed the doctor's death was inextricably linked to the cessation of the monster's crimes. In 2002, Minghini made a dramatic move. He ordered the exhumation of Narducci's body. What the forensic pathologists found was shocking, and it blew the case wide open once again. The body in Narducci's coffin, which had been buried for 17 years, was subjected to a new autopsy. The results were explosive. The pathologists concluded that the cause of death was not drowning, but asphyxiation by strangulation. They found evidence of a broken hyoid bone in the neck, a classic sign of manual strangulation. Furthermore, they determined that the body had been dead for a significant period before it ever entered the water. Francesco Narducci had been murdered. This bombshell finding transformed the second-level theory from a wild conspiracy into a credible line of police inquiry. The investigation into the Monster of Florence was no longer just about a gang of peeping Toms in Florence. It was now a murder investigation into a wealthy doctor in Perugia. Minghini's investigation began to pull at the threads connecting the two worlds. He re-interviewed the star witness from the previous trial, Giancarlo Lotti, and Lotti, ever the chameleon, began to change his story once again. In his new testimony, he added a crucial detail he had previously omitted. He claimed that after some of the murders, Pacciani and Vanni would meet with a mysterious, well-dressed man to whom they would deliver the excised body parts. He even claimed that on one occasion he drove Pacciani to a villa near Lake Trasimeno, the very lake where Narducci's body was found, to make one of these deliveries. He spoke of a doctor who paid them for their gruesome work. Lotti's testimony, while still unreliable, now explicitly described the existence of a second level, a client who was commissioning the killings. The focus also returned to the San Casciano pharmacist Francesco Calamandrei. Investigators alleged he was a key intermediary, a bridge between the Perugian cult and the Florentine killers. They gathered testimony from witnesses who claimed Calamandrei practiced black magic and had tried to recruit them into a satanic sect. One witness, a local prostitute, even claimed that Calamandrei had confessed his involvement in the monster's crimes to her. The theory now had a clear structure. Narducci was the mastermind, the client demanding the trophies for his rituals. Calamandrei was the middleman, relaying instructions, and Pacciani, Vanni, and Lotti were the postmen of death, the disposable grunts who carried out the bloody work. This theory explained so many of the case's lingering inconsistencies. It explained the motive. It explained the seemingly surgical nature of the mutilations. It explained the killer's apparent sophistication and knowledge of police blind spots, which could have been provided by the educated masterminds. Most compellingly, it explained why the murders stopped so abruptly. The cult's leader had been murdered, likely by his own co-conspirators, who feared he was about to be exposed, and the entire dark enterprise collapsed overnight. The theory was elegant, comprehensive, and terrifying. However, like every other theory in the Monster of Florence case, it ultimately collapsed in court. Prosecutor Minghini brought charges against Calamandrei and a dozen other potential suspects, but the case was built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of highly questionable witnesses like Lotti. There was no direct physical evidence linking Narducci or Calamandrei to any of the crime scenes. The defense attorneys tore into the prosecution's case, portraying it as a medieval witch hunt, a fantasy constructed by an overzealous prosecutor. They argued that Lotti was a proven liar who would say anything to get attention or a better deal, and that the other witnesses were unreliable gossips. In 2008, after a lengthy and complex trial, all the defendants in the second-level case were acquitted. The court ruled that there was simply not enough evidence to prove the existence of the conspiracy. The acquittal marked the final definitive failure of the Italian state to solve the mystery. They had tried and failed to convict the Sardinians. They had convicted Pacciani, only to see him acquitted and then die. They had convicted the Friends of the Snack Bar in a verdict that satisfied no one. And finally, their most ambitious and far-reaching theory, the second-level conspiracy, had disintegrated in a courtroom. The legal road had come to a dead end, and yet the theory refuses to die. For many journalists, investigators, and armchair detectives, it remains the most plausible explanation for the crimes. It is the ghost that haunts the official record, a chilling reminder that the convicted killers may have only been the puppets, and the real monsters, the wealthy and powerful puppeteers, got away with it all. Their identity is forever shielded by a wall of silence, money, and death. The labyrinthine tale of the Monster of Florence, with its decades of terror and investigative failure, feels uniquely Italian, a modern horror story born in the ancient cypress-studded hills of Tuscany. Yet the dark ripples of this case spread far beyond Italy's borders, finding eerie echoes in America's own criminal folklore, and, in a strange twist of fate, providing direct inspiration for one of the most terrifying figures in modern fiction. The story of Il Mostro is not just a Tuscan story, it has a profound and unsettling American connection. The first and most striking parallel is with a phantom who haunted another landscape half a world away, Northern California's Zodiac Killer. The similarities between the two cases are uncanny, as if two separate nightmares were scripted by the same malevolent author. Both killers turned lovers' lanes, places of intimacy and escape, into hunting grounds. The Monster of Florence exclusively targeted courting couples in their cars, a pattern the Zodiac followed in several of his canonical attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. Both killers operated with a chilling blend of brutal efficiency and theatrical bravado. The monster's weapon of choice was the .22 caliber Beretta. The Zodiac, too, favored a pistol, using it in his first confirmed attacks, but the deepest parallel lies not in the how of their crimes, but in the why of their behavior afterward. Both killers displayed a profound psychological need to taunt the authorities and insert themselves into the public narrative. They were not content to be anonymous phantoms. They wanted credit. They wanted fear. and they wanted to play a game with those who pursued them. The Zodiac's game was one of cryptic ciphers and boastful letters mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle, famously beginning with the chilling line, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He sent pieces of a victim's bloody shirt as proof of his deeds, a tangible token of his power. The Monster of Florence played a similar, even more gruesome game. His taunts were not written in code, but in flesh. The 1985 mailing of a piece of Nadine Moriott's breast to the prosecutor's office was a direct communication, an act of supreme defiance and mockery that mirrored the Zodiac's own twisted correspondence. Both cases remained in the public consciousness, fundamentally unsolved. The identity of the Zodiac is one of America's greatest criminal mysteries, while the true identity of the Monster of Florence is buried under layers of contradictory theories and flawed convictions. They are mirror images of failure, two dark legends that prove how a single cunning killer can terrorize a society and haunt it for generations. This parallel, however, is one of eerie coincidence. The second American connection is one of direct, conscious inspiration. In the early 1990s, as the investigation into Pietro Pacciani was reaching a fever pitch, the American author Thomas Harris was living in Florence. Harris was already a literary superstar, the creator of the monstrously sophisticated cannibal, Dr. Hannibal Lecter. He had come to the ancient city to soak in its atmosphere while working on the sequel to his blockbuster novel, The Silence of the Lambs. He arrived to find a city not just steeped in Renaissance art, but gripped by a very real, very modern monster. Harris became fascinated, then obsessed with the case. He became a sort of crime tourist, attending the sensational 1994 trial of Pietro Pacciani. Day after day he sat in the Florentine courtroom, a quiet observer, watching the grand legal theater unfold. He watched the coarse, belligerent farmer Pacciani yelling from his cage. He listened to the prosecution lay out its case, built on circumstantial evidence and character assassination. He absorbed the atmosphere of a city desperate to give a face to its fear, and he took what he saw and transmuted it into fiction, using the real-life horror of the Monster of Florence as the direct inspiration for his novel, Hannibal. The connection is not subtle. In the novel, Dr. Lecter, having escaped his American prison, is discovered living in Florence under the alias Dr. Fell, a respected erudite curator of the Palazzo Capponi Library. Harris places his fictional monster in the very city being terrorized by a real one. But the inspiration runs deeper than mere setting. The central Italian character in the novel is an ambitious and ultimately corrupt Florentine police inspector named Rinaldo Pazzi. Inspector Pazzi becomes obsessed with capturing Lecter, not for justice, but for a multi-million-dollar bounty. Pazzi is a clear literary echo of the real-life Italian investigators, whose careers were defined and, in many cases, destroyed by their obsessive, years-long hunt for the monster. The fate of Inspector Pazzi in the novel is a gruesome metaphor for the real-life failures of the investigation. After his plan to capture Lecter backfires, he is murdered by the cannibal in a manner that evokes the historical hanging of one of his own ancestors. Harris uses the character of Pazzi to explore the same themes of ambition, obsession, and failure that defined the real Monster of Florence case. He saw, in the Pacciani trial, a story not just about a killer, but about the flawed men who hunted him. The Monster of Florence provided Thomas Harris with more than a backdrop. It gave him a narrative framework, a cast of archetypes, and a real-world stage for his fictional horrors. Through the mind of one of America's most successful authors, the sordid, tragic reality of the Tuscan hills was reborn as a global pop culture phenomenon, forever linking the brutish farmer Pacciani with the sophisticated monster Hannibal Lecter in a strange and enduring legacy. The story ends where it began, in the rolling hills of Tuscany. For centuries, these hills have been a symbol of beauty, art, and civilization. But for 17 years, they were a hunting ground, and for the 40 years since, they have been a tomb, holding one of modern Italy's darkest secrets. After decades of investigations, thousands of pages of documents, dozens of suspects, multiple trials, and millions of euros spent, the labyrinth of the Monster of Florence has led nowhere. The case file is officially closed, but the story has no ending. The only thing that has ever been certain is the uncertainty. The path of the investigation is a monument to failure, a tragic epic of institutional incompetence. It began with the Sardinian Trail, a stubborn obsession that led police down a blind alley for more than a decade, chasing a ghost while the real killer continued his work unimpeded. The lives of the Vinci and Melee families were destroyed by this misdirection, the first of many innocent victims sacrificed on the altar of a flawed theory. Then came the farmer Pietro Pacciani. The state found its monster, a coarse and violent peasant who perfectly fit their narrative. They convicted him, but the evidence was flimsy and the verdict was overturned, leaving the public and the judiciary in a state of whiplash. He died before they could try him again, a villain to some, a scapegoat to others, his guilt or innocence forever unresolved. From the ashes of the Pacciani case, the prosecution salvaged the Friends of the Snack Bar, an official solution that satisfied almost no one. This theory, built on the shifting sands of testimony from a pathological liar and a dying disabled man, felt less like an investigation and more like an act of desperation. It led to convictions, but it did not lead to the truth. And finally, there was the second level, the chilling theory of a satanic cult of wealthy professionals commissioning the murders. It was a narrative that explained everything, from the motive to the timing, but it could not be proven in court, collapsing into a sensational but legally empty conspiracy. Each theory was a dead end, each failure compounded the last, and with every wrong turn, the human cost mounted. The first and most important victims were the 16 young people murdered in their cars. They were not just names in a case file. They were sons and daughters, lovers and friends. Pasquale Gentilicore and Stefano Pettini, Barbara Locci and Antonio Lobianco, Carmela Denuccio and Giovanni Foggi, Stefano Baldi and Susanna Cambi, Horst Wilhelm Meyer and Jensuvi Rusch, Paolo Manardi and Antonella Migliorini, Jean-Michel Kravitzvili and Nadine Maurio, their lives full of promise, were extinguished in moments of unimaginable terror. Their memory is the ghost that haunts this entire saga. But they were not the only victims. The investigation created its own wave of destruction. The lives of the wrongly accused were shattered. Men spent years in prison for crimes they did not commit. Families were torn apart by suspicion and public condemnation. The search for the monster created monsters out of innocent men, their reputations and lives ruined by a justice system that was flailing in the dark. And so we are left with silence. The killings stopped in 1985, as abruptly and mysteriously as they began. And the single most important piece of evidence, the one object that could cut through all the lies and theories, has never been found. The .22 caliber Beretta pistol, used in every single one of the monster's 8 double homicides, remains missing. It is the silent protagonist of this story, the thread connecting every victim, and its absence is the ultimate symbol of the case's enduring failure. The Tuscan Hills have kept their silence for nearly 40 years. The consensus among those who have studied the case is that the full truth has never been revealed and likely never will be. We are left only with the haunting, unanswerable question that hangs in the air like the morning mist over Florence. Who was the monster? Was he a lone, brutish farmer, driven by an unknowable rage? Was he the leader of a pathetic gang of voyeurs who stumbled from peeping to murder? Was he merely the instrument of a dark and powerful cult, a delivery man of death for educated masters? Or, in the most chilling possibility of all, was he someone else entirely? Someone who was never a suspect, never interrogated, never even considered. Someone who watched this decades-long circus of failure and chaos unfold from the shadows, and then, when the time was right, simply walked away, melting back into society, leaving behind a perfect, impenetrable mystery. We will never know. Only the hills remember, and they are not talking.